All right. I'm going to take us through the new workflow boards, and I'm going to do this in two different ways. The first time is going to be, I'm going to try to keep it short and just kind of run through what each of the sections very briefly are and how the flow works. And then I'm going to take a little more time and go back through and talk about what happens in each of the different stages of our development cycle here, so or development flow. So the first thing, this is the board that if they had labels, I'd refer to this one as our validation track. So in this validation track, the very first thing is the validation backlog. And this is essentially saying this is something that we feel it's important to go figure out. Let's go prioritize it, figure out what we need to go do. There's a triage at the point where it's a backlog. It's really just about let's make sure that's prioritized the list. Prioritization is by moving these around, and then I will pull them into the problem validation where I'll do a triage that says, hey, what type of validation do we need to go do with this? It's going to need design. How much do I understand what we actually need to do here? From that, it will go into another backlog, which is the workflow for ready for design. And this will also have its own path of being organized. And then we'll go through a triage process as it goes into the design flow that determines how much design verification, things like that are going to be needed. We then get to the solution validation. And so solution validation is going to be the breakdown of like what additional information are we going to need, or do we understand that what we were trying to solve, and is this actually something that is going to be able to go ahead and start planning with. Once it goes into the workload solution validation, we will then get to the planning breakdown. So in planning breakdown, the next step will be to just understand where we would actually put this into a milestone, how we would try to prioritize that. It doesn't go into the milestone yet, but it's just the details that are needed to say, here's where we want to go and figure out how we're going to plan it. Things can get broken out at this point, become multiple issues, and those issues could go into the rest of the flow. The next thing would be an example of that, right, would be the use of the workflow for refinement. And this is maybe where we're going to say there's some spikes here or something that we need to go figure out. Once we get through that, CZ will then move it into ready for development. Now, ready for development doesn't mean that it's actually ready to go get picked up yet. But it does mean that we feel like the details that are outlined are good enough that we can start working on it from a development standpoint. It is still not scheduled into a milestone yet. Once we feel like we have this understood enough that we have space to put it into the next milestone, it will get applied the deliverable tag. Now on the 4th, we'll get together as a group and we'll say, hey, what are the items that are in this deliverable tag where we can go ahead and say these are the items we're going to put into the upcoming milestone, the next milestone. And so that will be this field where you have milestone as backlog still, and then the deliverable label is on it. You would also still have the ready for development. The other one you could have is scheduling. So scheduling is a little bit briefer of a process. It just says these are things we just need to go ahead and schedule. And they might be a lower priority item that are opportunistic to take on, or a shorter time period, things that we might want to try to look at from that aspect. And then we get to the build board, which is the one I think everybody is already fairly familiar with these labels. But when you actually get to the deliverable label and you're in the current milestone, you will have ready for development. And this is the bucket that we would pick from. It's understood this should also be prioritized in that the items are there, but it's not just about what the next item is. It can also impact like who's already working on something or who's already given some details on it. But this would be the next area. Workflow in dev, we're familiar with. This is going to be where you're actually working on the issue. It's suggested that by the time you're opening an MR, that's when you would actually have the label for workflow in dev. Because a lot of the breakdown thing like that should have actually happened ahead of time. We want to try to streamline that as much as possible to where like you can take up the issue that's already ready and you can just open the MR and start working on it. Workflow and review would be once you've, once you're actually getting the review cycle done for the MR. And occasionally what will happen is we'll find that we have things that are blocked. Now, when you have things that are blocked, we have them in this current milestone. We have work that is expected to, we think will be done, and we may be able to still get these ones unblocked and done in the current milestone. Else, we would want to not put these in the current milestone. They would be blocked in backlog. And then the last piece here is the verification. So, well, not the last piece, but then you'd have verification. So this is once you have something that is deployed, you're verifying it's correct. And then occasionally we'll have another piece here, which is waiting for security release. So this would be items that are in the release patch, the security release patch. We don't have any right now. And then the last little field over here is going to be for the full list of items that we have in 15.2. So if we've done all this and we've done it as planned, you could say that by the milestone or the milestone planning issue would reflect all the things that we have put into the workflow board and would even match prior to that that milestone starting would match the list of things that are in deliverable in this column right here, because at the point where they're in backlog, we would move them into 15.2, essentially in the same motion that we would be adding them into the planning issue, or the next milestone I meant, into the planning issue. There's another piece here. There's a lot of steps that go on, and I've created a little quick way to copy and paste this into issues. You will see this, you'll start getting tagged on it occasionally. But this is a kind of an audit track to say, like, what has been done on this issue? What stages has it gone through? Did we have to do design? Did it not get designed? And as we go through to the build track, we get a little bit more detail into what happens. It does, of course, record it down here at the bottom when these things would have occurred. We had to play a little bit of catch up in the current milestone, but we should be on track now for the next ones. One of the things that I do as I go into the validation backlog and go into the problem validation, so I'm going to determine if this is an issue that needs to have that list, the actual full list of process, because there's something that's in here that we want to dive into. I've also started to use this recently just to kind of create a back audit track of some of the things that have been put into the milestone, but maybe didn't go through all of the processes. And I wanted to kind of look at that in a little bit more depth and see if we can catch that up so that we don't have to pull it out of the milestone to go do additional validation or something. That is the first part of it. So now I'm going to go through each of these sections in a little bit more depth and talk about why they're there and what actually happens in each of these sections. So we start off with the first board. We have the validation backlog. And if you, over here on the right side of the screen, there are details that go into what happens for each of these stages. So validation backlog. The primary thing that's going on here is we're making sure the issue is up to date. Sometimes this means that we already know we need to break it out. We might make it an epic. We make sure that if it's in an epic, details about this issue are recorded in that epic. We look at it, what's going to be kind of needed as more of a quick glance, because the ultimate goal here is that we want to make sure we're prioritizing the backlog, right? That we actually have items that make sense to be in the backlog, and then we have a way to prioritize. And if we don't have those enough detail, then that's what we need to get so that we can really take it into the validation backlog. Next piece here is going to be the problem validation. So there is a little bit of triage that happens when you're doing problem validation. You need to understand what are we going to be looking at in the problem, but ultimately it's about thoroughly understanding the problem. So we may use a bunch of various tools that are listed here, but the overall goal here is that, there are times when you need to for example, engage in UX research to understand something. And occasionally with like a bug, we might want to go and understand, what is the real customer impact on that bug, right? But we need to have a thorough understanding of what that problem is as like the primary thing that we're doing with problem validation, or that I'm doing the problem validation. Also, that's important with this is that you have roles that are assigned. Now, the DRI does not mean necessarily that all of the things that happen are done by the product manager, but that I'm going to be responsible to make sure that the right things are getting done and that we're keeping on track, and also that we're not overloading the resources that we have. So it's when you see that as the DRI, it is the person you would ask questions to. It is, what you would essentially get answers from. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all the work gets done by that one individual. At the end of the day, GitLab is a massive, huge team of people that all contribute in different ways, and it takes a lot of them to actually help make things flow correctly sometimes. So at the end of this, it all needs to be documented in the issue. We are definitely going with the concept that the single source of truth is going to be the issue. And we want to make sure that we continue to update these details, and that as we look at the problem validation, it also, gets the right level of research into it, and that goes back into the same issues. Then we get to the workflow design. Now, before design, we have ready for design. Not every team was going to use ready for design. We always, I feel, have enough work that we need to continue to have a design backlog. I like the idea of it because, design, when done best, takes a certain amount of time, right? Some things aren't going to be that difficult, but I don't want to rush design. So I think it's smart to have a ready for design or a design backlog. But at the point where it comes in here, you would have already validated the problem. You said, here's the problem. We know the impacts. Here's how we think we need to look at it. Additional pieces will take place during the design backlog to make sure that it's being, prioritized correctly, that we're pulling in work that makes sense for how we're looking at, overall impacts. There are still pieces that happen as we're working with the ready for design and the design flow. And a good example here would be when we go into the think big and then think small sections to really try to understand, is this design going to be expandable in the future, right? Like how could we make this better? How do we not just, make something a table when it actually needs to be a page, or, even at that point, like where would we start to actually create something? How do we ensure we're working towards the MVC of that version? Shared understanding in the team as proposed. So design, it does not happen in a vacuum, but there is somebody responsible for design. But it's about making sure that when you're making some of these decisions on how something needs to look, that it's transparent, that people understand why it's valuable, what the kind of options are, that it's not just that it actually, probably one of the things that matters a lot is that you are getting to a point where it does meet our style guidelines, right? That we are using and reusing examples of how we're trying to solve these problems in other parts of GitLab, so it ensures the same type of feel. Technical feasibility. So as the product designer is working through something, oftentimes will come up that we need to look at something that has backend requirements, or is potentially even using a technology we don't use. But really, it's just about saying, like, I would say more of, is it possible or not, is not the answer. What does it take for it, right? Like, how is design also incorporating that, how this will get solved and how it becomes technically feasible works without being a huge amount of like unnecessary work, or that there's maybe an easier way that some of these things can be done. So updated issue and epic descriptions. This happens with the product manager, myself. So as we get through the design, we want to make sure that we've got, again, the single source truth. That issue needs to be updated. If there's details about that issue that need to be updated at the epic level, the epic also needs to be updated. But keeping that information up to date is critical for this process to really flow correctly. Shouldn't have to dive around in too many places to try to get answers. There is also a call about dog fooding. A lot of times we're working on something that is early enough stage or not mature enough that you really have to rely on feedback that's coming in from dog fooding. So that is a sometimes step that happens. Again, all of this is not completely documented, but the highlights are documented in the little audit track piece that I had created. Oh, here we go. There it is. Right. So I actually have the details in here to kind of explain, like, here's what's going on. Here's where those steps took place. Over time, I think we may simplify this out more, and we might just end up with like making sure labels were added when we're supposed to, but giving the quick description of what happens in each of these areas while we're in the process of changing and learning, I think is helpful, a helpful reminder without having to continue to cross-reference back to the guidelines that are given from the process flow. Okay, so we're gonna go back to design, and we're moving on into solution validation. So this is also primarily going to be done with the product designer, and it's about making sure there's a couple of things, right? You got to make sure there's a high confidence approach in the proposed solution. This would include making sure that you're going back to saying, hey, what was the problem we were trying to solve, and did we actually go back and solve that problem, or did we come up with something that was different, and it needs to be a different issue or something, which is fine, but like, making sure that we're going back to that root problem and making sure it's solved. Documenting the learnings that may have come out of the research. So with things that are documented from insights and dovetail, and getting that into the documentation for the issue, or where we're actually going to connect those findings. And then we get into the next part of this, which goes to the build track. I will add one piece here. Design sometimes is going to get skipped because, actually a lot of times it gets skipped, I think, because it's something that doesn't require design. It could be a maintenance item, could be a bug that doesn't have a front end piece to it. But it's very common that we will have something that just, doesn't require design. I think if it's on the fence, I'm always going to, notify the product designer to get their feedback before we just kind of push it on through the solution validation, and then, or into plan even. So as we go into plan, what happens in plan? So the very first thing we have is the workflow planning breakdown. And so this is, again, when we're talking about getting something ready for a milestone, right? So we've already got it. It's understood. If there's design with it. We have, a good understanding of what the high level details are. And now we need to understand, where are we going to prioritize this work? Is it actually going to be in the very next milestone? Where is it going to live, right? When are we going to work on it? How is it actually, have other dependencies, or, other things that we're trying to get done that are ready? The existing workload and the current milestone has a big piece to do with it, and understanding what we're actually going to be finished and what might have to carry over. All those things are pretty important to really understanding what we're going to be putting into a milestone. So we will get to the portion where we're saying, yes, here is the things that we have as that candidate. We believe that they are going to go into that milestone. We will make sure that if they don't have the type label, that will be applied here. Usually we get it before then, but it needs to be in there before we take it in. The ready for development is really it's a prioritization effort that happens with PM and development to say, here's here's what we can take on, here's the scoping that next milestone. And then we'll apply this deliverable label. And as we do that, it will populate out all the things that we would need to really focus on and look at into the 15.2. We may have additional planning if we have to rebalance some of those areas out and decide and make trade-off decisions on what could go, what needs to wait, what can't wait. All those things kind of happen. So at this point, we're talking about that the issue you have is ready to be picked up and worked on. It's already, a lot of details they're contained. There may be some research, but it's on the, how we need to go develop it. But a lot of the pieces should already be in place by the time you get the well-scoped MVC issue. As we get into the planning for the milestone, this deliverable list would reflect what we'll be putting into the planning issue. And the planning issue is now going to be broken out with the types that are listed here. One of the things that has come up with the prioritization methods is that we're targeting a balance of how much feature development versus maintenance versus bug work happens in any given milestone. And this is different for each team, but the ideal target would be a 60% feature, 30% maintenance, and 10% bug. I think, and there'll be a review session where this actually gets reviewed by group leaders and segment leaders to say that's not enough, that maybe that isn't, maybe we have too much feature work or we have too much maintenance work. I have the opinion that for search takes a lot more maintenance than probably a lot of other parts of the product, but not all parts of the product. But so I think that 60, 30, 10, we will try to see how that goes. And I think that we will probably have some hard trade-offs to make to try to get to that. And we'll live with some things that are more tech that do even cause problems, but they maybe not be serious enough problems that the feature growth would be more important than actually ensuring stronger feature growth. So, this is something that isn't decided in a vacuum, and it gets reviewed at the leadership level so that, the understanding on why certain things are prioritized now has a lot more visibility, and we'll be able to get opinions and people can weigh in on, if we need to be shifting our focus from, less features, more maintenance, or vice versa, or, we need to make sure that some critical bugs are resolved so they don't miss SLOs before we get into it. But the good news about this is that this all happens as it should. It all happens prior to us getting to the point where we get into the build part of our roadmap. And so when we get into the build part, again, I think these are pretty relatively understood things in what happens for each one of them. I won't go into a lot of depth there. I'll just mention that this this board is set up so that if something didn't comply with previous steps, it won't show on this board. And the real big control here is that the milestone is started, which would include whatever the current one is based on date, and that we have the label of deliverable. And so this label, it doesn't get applied without certain checks supposed to be in place. And there's at least some way to kind of audit, see what checks did happen, what are the things that did happen. That audit actually helps us, not sure something gets done, but it actually helps us learn. So we might say, you know what, when we got to the development part, we actually needed to go do some more validation. It looks like we didn't have a lot or the right validation steps to really kind of narrow down what we needed to go do. And we can put that into the detail, right? We can go track that down and say, hey, here's how we want to make that change. Here's how we want to adjust the triage, and then loop that back in to help improve the overall process. So if you stuck with me through the whole video, I have good news. You have a little bit of a treat here, because I'm going to show you that now with this new method, the epic view in our workflow boards work. This has never worked for us before, and now it does. So now you can see for each epic, what are the items that are being included and where are they at? And it actually is really helpful to try to understand like how the progress of some of these epics are continuing forward. And also included the roadmap. So the roadmap works and it's updated. And this is all accurate to what we're working through. But yeah, all these things actually they all work now. And we can use that to help kind of understand planning, because priority doesn't always happen at an issue level. In fact, I'd say it doesn't happen at issue level. It happens at the epic level. And that, the epic needs to be very carefully thought out so that it includes the items that are needed to be complete. There's other things that come up. Those will decide if they need to be in the epic or not to be complete. But it's really about saying like, yeah, this is the feature, it's launched, and at the point where it launches, you are, complete. There are things you may go back and update and improve, but if you're launching the feature, it's done. So yeah. All right. That covers it. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.